So let's start the fourth session. So we have the pleasure to welcome Xiang, professor at Purdue University, on no pain, no gain, the effect of exports on job, injury, and sickness. 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I'm Xiang. I'm with the economics department at Purdue, so that may explain why many of you have no idea who I am. I really appreciate the organizers for putting our paper on this program, and I thank you for attending our talk. This is joint work with David Hummels, my colleague, and Jakob Monk at the University of Copenhagen. There's a typo on the program for the title of our paper. We look at job injury, not job inquiry. So in the 21st century, for many countries, there are two salient features to their economies. Number one is globalization. Number two, health and healthcare. A large literature, including our own previous work, examines how globalization affects wages and employment. This literature does not look at health. Another large line of work examines how various economic conditions, including social status, economic recessions, and plant closures, affect individual workers' health. This literature does not examine globalization. In this project, we try to bring these two lines of work together by asking the question, how do exports affect individual workers' health? And here's our hypothesis. Suppose our firm has a large order all of a sudden from Canada. Well, then that means more production and more output. As a worker, this is good news for me because I can expect higher wages. But on the other hand, I can also expect to work harder, more intensively, longer hours. According to medical research, high work intensity is associated with a wide range of adverse health outcomes, including higher blood pressure, high cortisol level, which is an indicator for stress and depression, and higher likelihood for heart diseases and strokes, and so on. It follows then that if rising exports lead to higher work intensity, rising exports should also have this wide range of adverse health outcome. In other words, globalization not only changes the sizes of our wallets, as previous research has demonstrated, also affects the sizes, or rather, the status of our physical and mental health. That's what we are trying to show. Given the medical research, we're going to focus on three aspects of workers' health in this paper. One, stress and depression. Two, heart diseases and strokes. And three, injury. Here's the outline for the rest of my talk. And I'll talk about additional connections to the literature when I discuss our theory framework, our data, and our specifications. The data we use to study in this project comes from Denmark. We start with the universe of Danish workers. And for each worker in Denmark, we observe their socioeconomic characteristics like wages, gender, marital status, and so on. We then move on to the universe of firms in Denmark between 1995 and 2006. And for each firm, we have the standard firm characteristics, capital, employment, output, and so on. Then for each firm, we observe detailed information about their trading behavior. To be specific, volumes of imports and exports by product, by destination, and source country. And we are able to match the universe of workers to the universe of firms in Denmark. And we are able to consistently track each worker and firm over time, regardless of the worker's employment status. For each worker, we have rich information about this worker's health. For instance, For every worker in Denmark, we observe in our data every prescription drug purchase this worker makes in our entire sample period. And for each purchase, we observe the exact date of the purchase. By week, we observe the types of prescription drugs purchased. We also observe the values in dollars of the prescription drug purchase. We have similar information about all the doctor visits in Denmark and about all the hospitalization in Denmark and so on. So that's our data. Now, how can you get such good data from Denmark? Well, because in Denmark, healthcare is funded by the government, free for all, and it's universal. And the Danish government keeps very good records. Anytime anybody has any interaction with the Danish healthcare system, they keep that in the administrative records, which are the sources of our data. So here, our data is different than the data used by previous studies as surveyed in Curry and Madrian that use access to healthcare data from the United States to examine health. In the United States, access to healthcare is correlated with your income and with your employment status. That is not the case in our data, not the case in Denmark. Okay, now as we have discussed, we have three aspects of health we want to focus on: stress and depression, heart diseases and strokes, and injury. So now let me show you the specific variables we are going to use. The first variable is a dummy, that is one, if a worker has a positive purchase of antidepressant in a given year. That's an indicator for severe depression. If you are using antidepressants, then you are depressed. So that's a very conservative definition for stress and depression. Okay? In our data, in our sample, when we look at all the workers, the mean of this variable is about 3 per 100, or the rate of depression is about 3 per 100. Now when we break out between men and women have higher rates of depression than men, about 4 per 100 versus 2.43 per 100. Now in medical research, this pattern is very robust. Regardless of sample, regardless of the definition for depression, regardless of the country, always the same pattern. So part of the reason could be that men and women have different responses physiologically to stressful events. Men become angry, whereas women tend to become sad. This difference between men and women motivates our empirical specification. We'll not only examine how exports affect individual workers' health, we will also examine how exports affect men and women differentially in our specification. Okay. Now, you may notice that we have far more men than women in that sample. Now, this is not the sample of all Danish workers. Otherwise, there will be a problem. Rather, I'll explain to you why we made our sample cuts after I show the identification strategy. And another dummy we have used is a dummy for using antidepressants or visiting a psychiatrist. Results are almost identical. We have other dummy variables for other types of prescription drugs. And we have one for sleep disorder. It's in there because sleep disorder is a common symptom of stress and depression. We also have all the prescription drugs that are antithrombotic agents. Main use of those is to keep heart attacks and strokes, prevent those things from happening, keep those things under control. Then we have a dummy for all the other prescription drugs for other types of heart diseases. For hospitalization, we also have a set of dummies. You could be hospitalized because of sleep disorder. That's a dummy. You could be hospitalized because of heart attacks or strokes. Okay? And we also have a dummy for poisoning, self-harm, or SORT. And the dummy really is our attempt to capture men's responses to stress and depression. If they become angry with reason, then maybe they want to break something, and if they are hospitalized, we get to observe those. Okay. Given that we have examined poisoning and assault, we speak to the recent studies that examine the broader effects of import competition. Effects on take-up rates of Social Security, disability insurance, US data, effects of injury, US data, and effects on homicide rates, Brazilian data. We focus on exports. We don't look at import competition. Here's our dummy variable for injury. Now in Denmark, if you are injured on the job, and if the injury is severe enough to cause permanent damage to your working ability, you are entitled to a one-time lump sum payment from the Danish government. To be eligible for that payment, have to file paperwork with a national board. The national board reviews the cases. They could reject the case, accept the case with no compensation, or accept the case with positive compensation. Our dummy is if the case is accepted with positive compensation. Okay. Looking at our data, the mean of this variable, or the injury rate, is about 4 per 1,000 in our sample. Let me draw out two differences with, again, studies using the US data. Difference number one is that our definition for injury, much more conservative, much more narrow than in the US data. US data includes all types of injury plus sickness. Okay? Our case is only very severe job injury. Second distinction is in Denmark, once you have received that lump sum compensation, most of the workers in our data go back into the labor force. They continue to work. That is really important for our identification because we can track those workers and observe changes over time. In the US data, however, once you are absorbed into SSDI, Social Security, disability insurance, it's like an absorbing stay. We don't see you in the labor force anymore. Okay, so far we have seen the variables for health, right? Stress and depression, heart attacks and strokes, and injury. And now, let me show you the variables we use to proxy for workers' efforts. The first variable we use is the number of hours. For a subsample of our sample, we observe the number of overtime hours per worker per year. And using that variable, we construct the number of total hours. So the interpretation is very straightforward. If you see longer hours, then the workers are working harder. We also observe workers' sick leave. And here we take full advantage of the rich information we have in our data set. We observe the exact dates of the sick leave spells, right? And we also observe the exact dates of all visits to doctors and all purchases of prescription drugs. And so we can ask the following question. When a worker claims sick leave, did the worker visit any doctor and make any prescription drug purchase during that spell of sick leave, plus 1 week before and 1 week after? We do this window because our data is weekly. Okay? Now, if the answer is no, then the question is, what are you doing, right? You've claimed sick leave, you're not seeing any doctor, you're not purchasing any prescription drug. So maybe you are watching soccer. It's Denmark, not the United States. Or maybe you are just a little bit sick, but not sick enough to do those things, right? Either case, we believe that this is an adjustment margin. You could have chosen to work instead of staying home. So the interpretation is, if we observe a reduction in this type of minor sick days, it's an indication that the workers are increasing efforts. Okay? So in our sample, the number of minor sick days is about 0.2 per worker in a given year. After taking out these minor sick days, we call the rest major sick days. And the sample mean about 6 per day per worker per year. Most of the sick leave is in fact major sick leave days. And for that variable, the interpretation is more sort of subtle because the workers could be sick or, the workers may also be just staying home. It's not 100% certain. I say that because previous research has used the number of sick leave days as a measure of shirking or efforts. Unlike what we can do, these studies cannot distinguish between major and minor sick leave days. And I'll show you in the results section that minor and major sick leave days have different responses to rising exports. So we have talked about our data, and given that we're using panel data to study health, we contribute to the large literature that also uses panel data to look at health. In economics, we have the well-known literature about plant closure and mortality and hospitalization pioneered by Sullivan and von Wachter. And there are other studies that use Danish data to look at how things like organizational changes affect health. Then, outside of economics, in medical research and social science and so on, two extremely well-known samples, Framingham Heart sample and the Whitehorn sample. Now, relative to all those studies, we focus on globalization and we use a different identification strategy, as I'll explain down the road. So we wrote down a theory model in order to formalize our idea and to derive our estimation equation. Now, because of time constraints, I will not write down any equation, and I'll just describe the framework in words. Workers ultimately choose the effort level by equalizing marginal benefit with marginal cost. As exports rise, demand for output rises, marginal benefit of effort rises. So workers choose to increase effort level. From this framework, we can derive the following equation. In this equation, the subscript I is a worker, J is a firm, and T is a year. The left-hand side is the log of the effort level of each worker. On the right-hand side, we have the main variables, log of export by the firm, and the interaction of log export with a female dummy. We have that interaction because we discussed earlier, men and women may have different responses to rising exports. Then we have the characteristics, small x, it, worker characteristics as controls, small z, jt, vector of firm characteristics as controls, and then a bunch of fixed effects. ij is job spiral fixed effects, region fixed effects, industry by year fixed effects. Now we cannot estimate this equation because we don't observe E, I, J, T. So we are going to estimate instead this pair of equations. The right-hand sides of the equations are exactly the same as what we saw before in the previous slide. The left-hand side, of course, is different. In the first equation, IOS is the set of variables for health that we have seen before, right? And by estimating this equation, we show how rising exports affect individual workers' health. The main coefficient of interest is the effect of export on men, beta 1, and the effect on women, beta 1 plus beta 2. Then the second equation is the mechanism through which exports affect workers' health. And the variable WK is the variables for workers' efforts that we have seen, right? Again, main coefficient of interest, beta 1 for men, beta 1 plus beta 2 for women. Now, there are two challenges for identification. Challenge number one, across workers, there's a huge number of idiosyncratic factors that affect your health. An example is the large literature on early child development or prenatal development. An example is the work by Case and Paxton, who highlight the importance of your height at the age of 3. There's no way we can control for all of those things in our worker characteristic control set. But fortunately, we have panel, and we are able to track the workers and firms consistently over time. So we are using job sparrow fixed effects, and those idiosyncratic factors will be removed since they are time invariant. So the identification question we ask is really, during my employment duration with Purdue, suppose Purdue, for exogenous reasons, increases exports. How does that affect my health? So it's all about changes over time. Second challenge is that the main variable of interest export is endogenous. A large literature shows that firms are different. Large and productive firms export a lot. And these large and productive firms may also have good technology or good management that reduces the injury rate and sickness rate of their labor force. This means we're going to have a negative correlation between exports and that error term, right? Again, good firms export a lot. Good firms may have good stuff that reduces injury and sickness rates. This means if we just go ahead and run this regression without addressing the endogeneity issue, our estimate would have a downward bias. Okay? So how do we address this issue? We follow our previous work and construct instruments for exports and the interaction of the female dummy with exports. We use sharks that originate outside of Denmark as instruments. Well, again, because of time constraints, I cannot go into the specifics. They are in the paper. So now I can tell you exactly how we cut our sample. Our story is about how exports affect workers' health, including injury. So this means we need sectors of the economy where firms export frequently and where job injury is also frequent, right? That cuts us down to manufacturing, agriculture, fishing, and manufacturing, and mining. I'm sorry, but relative to manufacturing, agriculture and fishing is just tiny in terms of employment. My apologies. Same for mining. And within the manufacturing sector, some firms never export. They have to go, right? And we look at the larger firms because they have better data for things like capital stock that we use as controls. So that explains our sample. And in our sample, we explain a large fraction of manufacturing employment in Denmark and also the total exports of the entire Danish economy. Now I can show you the results. First, for the antidepressant dummy. Here, let me first talk about the results for women, then I'll come back to the results for men. While we do not control for the endogeneity of exports, we have a small positive effect for women. Okay? Now, when we do control for the endogeneity of exports, the coefficient estimate for women much, much larger, positive. So that is consistent with our earlier discussion for this negative correlation between export and the error term, and a downward bias if we do not use IV. The magnitude of this, of the effect of export on women is now beta 1 plus beta 2, or about 0.01 or 1 per 100. And to see the economic significance, we can compare the magnitude 1 per 100 with a sample mean of women's depression rate 4 per 100. So our coefficient estimate is large. Here's a second way to see the economic significance of our IV estimate by comparing that with the coefficient of the marriage dummy. Now, we look at changes over time. So the marriage dummy says the following. If somebody gets married during a worker firm match, well, because this person is happier, it's good. Depression rate goes down, right? By 0.0049, about 5 per 1,000. Very nice, right? However, what happens if the employer increases exports? Well, suppose exports rise by 10%, not uncommon in our data. Then your depression rate increases. By how much? By 10% times 0.01 or 1 per thousand. So this reduction, 1 per thousand, is a large fraction of the boost you get from getting happily married, which is about 5 per thousand. Okay? Now let me go back to look at effects on men. So what's going on with men? Whether with or without IV, we have small negative coefficient estimates for men, meaning that they have lower depression rates as exports rise. So this is probably driven by the following mechanism, not in our framework so far. In our previous work, we demonstrate that as exports rise, wages are higher for both men and also for women. Okay? So with higher wages, men could simply be having happier subjective feelings, higher earnings, higher wages. So I think the results for men make the results for women even more striking. Despite higher wages and higher earnings, women have higher depression rates. How can that possibly happen, right? So that's exactly our hypothesis. Higher stress on the job, higher work intensity, and so on, right? I'll show you later direct evidence concerning this mechanism. Finally, as I said earlier, when we use the other dummy to also include visiting psychiatrists, results are almost identical. Now, these are the results we have for the other dummies for prescription drugs and the other dummies for hospitalization. In most cases, we don't find much, with two exceptions. One is the prescription drug for heart attacks or strokes. Those are the antithrombotic agents. And the second one is also about heart attacks or strokes, but here we have hospitalization. Okay? Now, there are some similarities between the two cases where we find statistically significant results. First, we find these results only under IV, okay? Not under OLS, so to speak. And our IV estimates much larger than without IV, consistent with our previous discussion of the direction of the bias. Second is that both happened for women, consistent with our previous results for stress and depression, right? And of course, finally, they are both about heart attacks and strokes. Now, these are the results we have for injury. Now, when we don't control for endogeneity of exports, small positive coefficient estimate. When we control for endogeneity, much larger positive coefficient estimate, which by now is a familiar pattern. Okay. In this case, unlike previous results, the interaction non-statistically significant, so both men and women have higher injury rates in response to exports. Now to translate, to see the economic significance of the IV estimate, I'm going to translate this coefficient estimate into an elasticity by dividing it by the sample mean injury rate. So we get an elasticity of about 0.488. That's large. And I'll come back to this elasticity in just a minute. Okay. Now, one issue with the IV estimate is it's only marginally significant. And this could be because of nonlinear effects. And to look at that, we examine the predicted value of our exports, organize this variable into 4 quartile dummies, and interact these dummies with the gender dummies. Okay? And now we get statistical significance pretty much across the board. And we see some nonlinear effects in the sense that the second quartile export dummy has the same similar coefficient as the third quartile export dummies. Okay. Now we have, so far we have shown you the results for the variables of health. And now we can look at the results for the variables that measure efforts, right? Do workers increase efforts as exports increase, as we have hypothesized? The first variable we look at is the log of hours for the subsample where we have data. And positive significant, marginally significant coefficient estimate under IV. So that is consistent with our hypothesis. And the magnitude of this coefficient is also useful in telling us something more. The magnitude is about 0.1159. Okay? It's smaller than the elasticity of injury. So this means the percentage response of hours is lower than the percentage responses of injury rate. So this means if we define injury rate on a per hour basis, that will be an increase. So this is an indication that we have intensive margin responses as well. Workers are not only working longer hours, they are also likely to be working more intensively given the same number of hours because injury rate per hour is rising. Okay. Again, the coefficient estimate is marginally significant, so we go to nonlinear dummy specification. Now we have statistical significance only for the second and third quartile export dummies. We don't have anything for the fourth quartile export dummies. What's going on? I'll come back to this point in just a moment. Okay, now we can look at the results for the number of minor sick leave days. There I jump straight to the nonlinear specifications, and we see negative coefficient estimates, again for second and third quartile export dummies. Now, as we said earlier, when workers reduce the number of minor sick days, they are increasing efforts. So these are consistent with our results for work hours. Okay. Again, nothing for the fourth quartile export dummies. I'm coming to that. So these are results for the number of major sick leave days. Again, for the second and third quartile export dummies, negative coefficient estimates. Same message as previous results. But when we go to the fourth quartile, the sign flipped. And when we first saw these results, we said, oh my God, we are dead. And then we thought about it a bit and said, wait a minute, the major sick leave days could be indication that the workers are genuinely sick. They may be too sick to work, right? So which one is the case? Is it the workers being too sick to work, our story, or is it that the workers are simply shirking, which is exactly the opposite to our hypothesis? Now, if you look at these estimates alone, it's very hard to tell. There's no way to tell. So why don't we go back to the previous results and ask the following question. In response to fourth quartile export shocks, do workers reduce the number of hours? No, they don't. Do workers reduce the number of minor sick leave days? No, they don't. So in spite of having more major sick leave days, workers do not cut back on the hours. They do not cut back on the minor sick leave days. So to us, that's an indication, evidence that the workers are too sick to work. And they are increasing efforts despite the sickness because they do not cut back. Okay, so we have shown you the results, and our results really highlight this following trade-off. With rising exports, workers suffer a higher rate of injury and multiple types of sickness. Trade-off between a positive economic shock and adverse health consequences. Our results, as far as we know, are new, narrow to the literature, and this trade-off is reminiscent of the line of work pioneered by Rome, looking at how recession affects mortality. There the story is, as the United States experiences an economic boom, workers work harder, more traffic accidents, mortality increases. Okay? Recent study by Egan, Mulligan, and Philipson take this one step further and say, if we take into account the implicit monetary value of changes in mortality, then the year-to-year fluctuation of the US macroeconomy will be reduced because mortality is pro-cyclical. Okay. Following this line of thought, we ask the following question. Our results show a microchannel, concrete microchannel, through which rising exports affect workers' health, in particular injury. Okay? Suppose we take our micro estimate obtained in a sample 95 to 2006 and do an out-of-sample forecast for Denmark during the most recent economic recession, 2007 to 2009. Can we say anything useful about changes in the macro variables, total injury count and total injury rate?
5 minutes.
Okay. So this picture shows that we have a recession in Denmark. What's not shown is that this is also the Great Trade Collapse. Exports decreased by 17 percentage points. This is a picture showing a reduction in total injury count. But of course, there's also a reduction in employment. Total injury rate still goes down. And that's the magnitude of the actual reduction. How about our predicted reduction? Well, 17% decline, and our IV estimate imply a reduction of so much, okay, which is large relative to the actual reduction. Okay? And we can also predict the changes in the injury count. And we do a good job because we do a good job of predicting changes in the injury rate. Now here I can go back to the title of our paper and think about the gain and pain from globalization. The pain is what we have seen. Higher rates of injury and multiple types of non-fatal diseases. And the gain is what we show in our previous results, higher wages because of rising exports. How large is the pain relative to the gain? To answer this question, we need to calculate the welfare effects of higher rates of injury and sickness. In the literature, the welfare calculations for injury and mortality were well established, pioneered by Viscusi, used by many others. However, when it comes to the welfare calculations for non-fatal diseases, there's not much out there. The only framework we are aware of in economics is the work by Finkelstein, Lutmer, and Noto-Widicdu. Their approach requires data on subjective happiness, which we do not have. Outside of economics, in policy circles, World Health Organization, Gates and the Gates Foundation, the standard approach is daily. There you convert a life year with a disease into a fraction of a life year disease-free. Now, this is a nice approach, except that those discount factors are obtained by survey questions for WHO and public health officials, right? As economists, we feel that those do not reflect people's optimal choices. So we write down our own framework. Again, time constraint, details are in the paper. Using this framework, we show that relative to the wage gain, man's pain is 4.2 percentage points, woman 18.8 percentage points. Now these are pretty substantial numbers, right? So why is the number smaller for men than for women? Two reasons. One is that men have higher average wages. Two, most of the higher rates of diseases happen for women, not for men. So we stick to the gains of trade literature as well. Now to conclude, these are the results we show, new and novel to the literature. Going back to the earlier point that came up in the discussion. Are exports good or bad? Okay. So here's what we think. Exports are good, but like sports and exercises, you could get injured if you're not careful. Now let me draw out two further implications of our results. One is our result for injury and sickness rates. We showed early that these micro estimates are informative about movements of macro variables as well. And second piece is our results for depression and stress, right? And this really highlights the importance of mental health in our global economy. This is, in fact, reminiscent of Sigmund Freud. In his masterpiece, his hypothesis is, as the civil society develops in terms of profits and technology, the citizens become neurotic and discontent. Okay? And it's also complementary with recent work by Case and Deaton. They show higher mortality rates for middle-aged Americans, middle-aged white Americans, driven by what? Suicides, drug and alcohol poisoning, and chronic liver diseases. And they also report for this group declines in mental health and midlife stress, excuse me. So all this, I believe, highlight the large and increasing demand for mental health care in our economy because exports continue to grow around the globe. Okay? So you may ask, what's the supply side? Well, here's the bad news. In the United States, in 44 states in this country, the largest mental health institute is exactly as you see in this picture, a prison. The good news is many large US firms recognize the importance of mental health of their employees, and they are spending money. And what you see in the picture is a living wall of plants. And that's one of the many ways the large companies help workers deal with job stress. Our results suggest that this could be money, in fact, well spent, especially if the company is expanding rapidly around the globe. That's it. Thank you.
Thomas Heckelei for discussions of the paper. Thomas.
Use the other one.
Okay.
The other one, yeah.
So, well, Chong already gave a good argument why I'm a non-expert here, because in a developed country, ag economist doesn't have much to do with the labor markets, or the relevance is limited. Well, as a non-expert here in this context, my first reaction to the title when Antoine asked me whether I would do this discussion opener, he was, well, why would this be interesting? Aren't there far more important determinants of worker health than exports? And what do we do if we find that exports, that there is actually a connection between exports and worker health? Do we have to reconsider policies on trade or whatever? Well, my first reaction didn't keep me from learning a lot from reading this paper and following a presentation. So I saw it is a very mature, carefully argued and well-designed research, and it's a paper that makes a lot out of a special and sort of unique data set as far as I can tell. It bridges the two strands of literature, so the health impacts of increased efforts and the labor impacts of trade. It distinguishes more than any other papers in the literature, so these different health measures. It has a large variety of different microchannels of how increased effort may affect health. It has a very careful discussion of the instruments. Yeah, he couldn't go into the details here, but it really taking care carefully about this endogeneity issue of the exports. And from the trade point of view, it really shows a significant non-pecuniary effect of trade. It's small but substantial. It's small relative to the wage gain nevertheless. So by issues that I have, they are more related to not details of the paper, some of the empirical strategies, but more related to the how far it's reaching and some of the interpretations. So I have 4 issues I want to talk about. So one is the relationship between exports and signets. So I was wondering whether the clear direction of impact that is identified in paper could also have to do with the way your data is defined, so that you have you cannot include things like plant closure and displacement effects. You cite them. However, you have stable worker-firm relationships in that, so this sort of effect maybe is not captured by the data. Then also the cited medical research that you talked about, I was wondering, and I will come back to the time horizon question, is sort of a long-term effects of stress on health. Whereas what you seem to be measuring, and we'll come to that, is more sort of short-term export shocks. So the other question, is it really exports that matter? So your intro, well, exports is one possible shock for the demand. In your intro you argue that export market shocks are used to have truly exogenous shocks, yeah, because you have the possibility to actually do that instrumentation. But nevertheless, other unexpected output changes might be going the same direction. So in terms of the interpretation, I was wondering, is it right to tie what you have so much to export and globalization? But it's, yeah, the work health effect comes also from a lot of other things. So it's really more general in terms of the health impacts of demand shocks. Then, somewhat related, the dynamics and time horizon. So you argue at some point that export shocks are more transient than other demand changes. So that might be some of the reasons why we observe these health effects, yeah, because we don't have these adjustments of capacity, the hiring, but it's more the increased work intensity. So, but doesn't that mean there should also be dynamic effects? So doesn't it imply that the initial state, so the extent to which a capacity is used or not, matters for how a shock works? Or more generally, is that the changes of export levels might be here the more relevant, or at least as relevant? So because also in your instead of the levels in your intro, you argue with the changes also. So the other time horizon issue, what about longer term effects? So does the sickness effects go away if the firms adjust? So if they hire, is it only a short-term effect? And in the long term, we only have the wage gains and things are taken care of. So I was wondering, that is, yeah, how you would react to this. The final thing, the gender results. I sort of understood why you said that it's sort of a support to your effort-related argumentation, but I still haven't understood also after your presentation why exactly are women affected more. Is it because maybe what you measure in terms of health effects, and the men it's coming out later, they get liver diseases and die out of suicide, and you cannot measure that with your short-term effects. So these are my points. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for the comments. And if you can send us your PowerPoint slides, that would be fantastic. You have asked a number of very good questions, and I'll try to address these questions one by one. A nice thing of our approach is we use IV. And we established in our previous work that our instruments are not correlated with domestic shocks in Denmark. So things like plant closure, domestic shocks, they will not affect our estimates because of our IV. That's the nice thing of our identification strategy. So we established that in our previous work. And to the extent that many of those things are time invariant, we have job sparrow fixed effects that's swept out. And I really like your question about, why it's women and not men, and can we say more about men? We tried a number of things, and people have told us to try to look at traffic accidents, bike accidents. We are trying, but so far we are still trying to see if we can get those things in the data. It's Denmark, I know, but there's only so much you can get even in Denmark. And the other question is it long-term or short-term? That's an excellent question. That's where we are going as our next step. We'll do a number of exercises. We'll see first, if we look at the 3-year moving averages for exports, similar results or not. And we can also look at the lag effects of exports, right? If we see export in year 1, does that have health consequences for year 2, year 3, and so on and so forth? So that go to some, that address kind of the question about long-term versus short-term. And then at the beginning, you raised this excellent question about policy implications. Why do we care, right? There are many other things that affect workers' health. Why look at exports? And our response is we do have the following clear, loud and clear policy implications. The provision for the mental health care showed how undersupplied it is, and we also have stigma for stress and depression, right? People even underreport their stress and depression in private survey questions. That shows how important the stigma is, right? Even if they know they will not be observed, they're still underreport their stress and depression. So in terms of public policy, how about a public campaign like the campaign against smoking that encouraged people to talk about stress and depression, that remove the stigma about stress and depression and mental health? How about the provision of mental health care? The recent Obamacare Affordable Health Care Act put that in place. For the first time in the United States, health insurance carriers are obligated to provide mental health care. So those are implications for policy that we can talk about using our results.
Thank you. Yes. 3 questions. Andrew.
Enjoyed your presentation, and actually also just sort of adding to what you said about not so much even public policy, but just sort of business policy, that it does sort of justify that as companies grow, they should invest in sort of the mental health of workers and sort of that to mitigate that negative effect. The only thing you didn't really address is sort of why is this necessarily an export story as opposed solely to sort of just the demand story. And if you think of sort of industries where we don't export in the United States, like during the housing boom, and you found some of the same effects. Then you even think about, say, the trucking industry, when there's great demand for trucking, and that you find some truck workers, then sort of they lie about the records and they drive extra hours and they're more likely to get in accidents. So I'm saying that it doesn't seem to be an export issue, more so just sort of an overall growth in the demand for a product for a particular industry from exports or otherwise, I think.
So Robert?
Yeah, fascinating study. Two questions. One is, you seem to be using the results from this very detailed data set and extrapolating to the United States. So I was wondering if you can comment to policy recommendations or policy implications, and whether you think that there are some caveats with that regarding the provision of social service care. And the second is, generally, we've seen concerns about the downturn, obviously the recessionary results that you looked at and the studies that looked at the effects of recession, job loss, sort of the other direction to what your results are pointing to. So I was wondering, did you look at directionality and how that may affect men and women differently in your data set? So whether you see a different result in terms of the loss of export, the loss of demand, for example, in terms of sickness and health variables relative to an increase in demand. So those are my two questions. Thanks.
Last questions and you respond.
Just a quick follow-up to that.
Okay.
Oh, sorry.
Quick question on something that Thomas mentioned. I think I'm not sure I got an answer. He talked about the stable worker-firm relationship. And in that context, your data set does not model entry and exit in the labor market, if I understand it correctly, right? And that's very relevant in the context of labor market sorting. And some of the work by Redding, Taviano and others talk about how people self-select to work in particular industries or particular areas and so on, spatially as well as companies-wise. So I'm not fully sure I understand how you got the IB part on the exports being endogenous, but when you bring in the labor market sorting story into it, there might be some self-selection going on. If I want to work for a good firm that's exporting, I go there and spend more time working for them rather than the other way. Okay, so I'm just kind of not sure about the endogeneity story in that context. And then the number of hours you got on the left-hand side, is it the same for everybody? Doesn't differentiate by the type of worker, production, non-production worker?
They are different by worker.
It's the production workers only?
Oh, it's for worker. It's worker level data.
Okay, all right. So
It's for each individual worker, not just by types.
okay.
So for
that's-
each worker, we know exactly how many hours this worker works in a given year.
Okay, all right.
Maybe you can respond to all questions, and
Okay.
after we take two other questions. So first response, and please, he responds, and after I give you the floor.
Thank you very much for the questions. So for the first one, is it more general than just exports? I would agree with you. It could potentially be more general. So why do we focus on exports? Well, one, because others have not looked at it. And two, we have plausible exogenous variation. If we could find plausible exogenous variation for domestic shocks, we would do it too. We just don't have that variation. Okay? And the other question about extrapolation to US, we have not exactly done that, but we did look at the changes in fatal injury in the United States. We did not look at non-fatal injury because definition is too different from what we use. If you look at the changes in fatal US injury, so it goes like this. It goes down during the recession, and it goes slightly back post-recession using all years of available data. Did we do a similar exercise as we did? No, we did not, but presumably we could. But for the other types of diseases, we have not done that yet. Presumably we could, but the issue is for the many other countries for which we don't have this kind of data, how useful that would be, so we are not sure. Or we would love to hear about your perspective because you're in the policy circle. So no, maybe we can talk afterwards as well. So, and the other point about labor market entry and exit, we are using job sparrow fixed effects. Whatever effects you have prior to entry or after or prior to exit, we sweep them out. So we are only looking at changes during a given worker-firm match. If you want to work for a good firm, you're already there. Given that you're already there, look at changes over time. So I don't think entry and exit affect what we are doing. If your question is, I'm curious about not only job sparrow within job sparrow, but also entry and exit, we have another approach that we can look at the total effects, including entry and exit. I'll have to explain that to you.
Two other questions first, and then William.
Chong, that was excellent. Rich in detail. I can't believe it. This worker-firm match. I was thinking about it in terms of sort of adjusting your framework to identify the health outcome you wanted to identify, and that is, have you thought about a non-parametric type of matching framework where you can, if you think about exports as being the treatment, then can you not compare, if you've got all this rich detail from Denmark, can you not compare in a matching framework, you've got all these covariates of firm worker characteristics, could you not match firm worker characteristics in export firms versus firm worker characteristics that are in domestic industries. And then it seems like if you had this matching non-parametrically, you could be a little more confident in comparing whether exports, have these effects on health outcomes. So that was just a thought. And the other one is, do you have any information, and I suppose this might be absorbed in the fixed effects, on pre-existing conditions or pre-existing health of workers, and whether firms invest, we know like Google and some of these multinational firms invest heavily in, workout and fitness facilities on site in the firm. Do you have any information on that?
Another questions, William? Okay, it's okay. So, yeah.
I got a couple of quick questions. So number one, the story here is that as exports rise, workers' efforts going to increase, which can cause distress. And I think we can all agree that that can happen. But really the mechanism here is that not exports rise, but that output rises. In a number of studies we've seen before, for example, that when firm level or industry level exports rise, total output might not change. There's just a simple substitution. You used to provide just for the domestic market, you're now exporting, for example, and so the fraction of your output that goes to the domestic market is no longer 100%, but it's something less. So there's really a substitution, in which case output doesn't rise, and it's very hard to make the argument that actually employees' effort should rise because they still produce as much as before. Now, there are stories there that can probably help you. For example, if they're producing for markets where, higher quality is required, and so you're going to have to put in more effort to produce higher quality, the Shapiro-Stiglitz framework can work, and then you can say, yes, well, probably workers have to put in more effort so they can produce higher quality, even though the output is still the same, you can do that. But it's hard to see here. Is there a different measure of worker effort that you can look at? How about output per worker? I know you have a piece on wages, and presumably if wages increase, you'd think that effort might increase, but that's not necessarily the case. It doesn't have to happen. Could you just look at the firm level output per worker on average and compare that when exports rise? Do you see that output per worker rises as well in terms of sales or revenue per worker? Because then you can at least more clearly make the case that effort actually increases because output per worker actually increases. The next thing, and I think this kind of follows up on Jason's comment, the extensive margin. Why get rid of the zero firms that don't export, right? So they obviously carry information. Is the distribution of health outcomes in those places similar to the distribution of health outcomes in firms that export? Do they tend to, at least some sort of summary statistics, are those workers just as depressed or less depressed if they're not exporting? According to your theory, they should be less depressed. But can we at least see some statistics sort of to quantify this? Can you control for imports, right? I mean, the idea here is that, imports also cause distress. This is something firms have to deal with. That's a sort of an exogenous shock in a sense. And so if they have to deal with that, they're more stressed because now there's more competition, so they have to become more efficient to trim the fat. And so if there's more imports, you're also more stressed. And imports tend to correlate with exports, both at the firm level and at the industry level. So don't we want to control for that, because that is also time variant, and right now it's hiding in the error term. So I think these are sort of the general few things, just to make the study and the interpretation more believable. I think that would be good to look at.
Maybe you can start to respond to the questions, and I take another questions from David.
Okay.
You can start.
Yeah. Again, thanks for the great questions. Pre-existing conditions swept out by job market fixed effect, by job sparrow fixed effects. What they do on the side about fitness, we don't have that, unfortunately. We would love to have that. It would be great, but we don't. Total output, we control for total output in the previous version. Results are almost identical. Imports, we control for imports as well. Did not show that in the results table, but it's in the paper. Matching techniques, propensity score matching, presumably that's what you have in mind. Yeah. Well, the assumption is that the characteristics you use to construct PSM have to be all the stuff, which is not obviously the correct assumption. Given we already have the IV from previous work, which we believe are far better than the assumptions implicit in PSM or the kinds of matching we are going to use with a go-go with our IV. And that also goes to the firms that don't export. We have no way to predicting why some firm exports and others don't, Remember, we rely on shocks that originate outside of Denmark. We do not try to predict the export dummy. The explanatory power would not be strong. We worry in that case. So that explains why we focus on the firms that export. I really appreciate you guys pushing us to expand the questions into more general directions, looking at more questions. Maybe we can do that in future research, but now our focus is really on getting the question nailed in identifications that are as clean as possible. That's our step one. Maybe later we can go in some of the directions you guys are suggesting. So,
last questions from David.
Oh, okay, thank you. Very quickly, I think that on one hand, have you looked at the result by level of skills or level of management and type of workers? Because in terms of stress, I think that can be quite relevant. My second comment, and I think like many other people, I will look at your IV strategy to understand exactly how you identify the export aspect, especially when we look at EU country like Denmark that is highly integrated with Germany, Netherlands, and so on. So when we think about export, are we talking to export to the rest of the world? Is it a shock really outside Europe or including Europe? Because most of the export of Danish firms are to Europe. That's basically one integrated economic zone. But here my concern is more to know also how we deal with subcontracting firms and basically all the firms providing inputs to the one exporting. And in many cases, at least from the business literature, we see that a lot of pressure are put not on the firm directly exporting, but on the firm providing inputs to the main exporter. So is it something that you can capture or not? I would be interested. My last point is about how you look at the trade crunch of the recession. And here, I would like basically to know, or you can look at it later, how you deal with the volume versus value aspect of this trade crash. Because it was more a value crash than a volume crash, meaning that the amount of output and the effort asked was still relatively important compared to the decline in the value of trade that we have seen. So maybe it's also why you have a kind of problem in your prediction compared to what was seen, because the value has quite much more than the volume, and maybe this is what also we have to capture. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thanks for those questions. In the first attempt we looked at interaction with skill, college education. The interaction term is completely insignificant. And we also looked at other occupational characteristics, management, and other characteristics related to management. The interaction term is not significant once we control for the gender interaction. Denmark is part of EU, and for exports and imports between Denmark and European countries, they still go through customs, but there's a cutoff, about 1 million something Danish kroner. That's why we focus on large firms. For those firms, we have better data. So to be really clear, even for trade between Denmark and European Union countries, they are in our data set, in the customs data set. We have that, okay? So it's not just between Denmark and outside of EU, it's between Denmark and all trading partners. And I really like your idea about input-output linkages. If I understand that correctly, you're asking, does this spread to the firms that supply inputs to the exporting firms or through input-output linkages? I really like that question, and maybe we can explore that in future research, but probably we have too much stuff in this paper already, but that's a very, 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 very good idea. Thank you for bringing that to us.